When it comes to bands that transcend their eras and continue to make music consistently well, few bands come to mind more often than AC/DC. They have been a constant of rock music throughout the 20th century and even the beginning of this millennium. They are consistently making amazing music despite band changes, setbacks, and a load of bullshit that's happened over the years. Nevertheless, they continue to soldier on and bring rock music to so many fans of all generations. Music that is absolutely unforgettable. Well, unless you're Malcolm Young, but we'll get there. Now, some would say that they're old, past their prime, and not very good, but to them I say, fuck off, they're amazing! Now, for the purposes of this video, I will not be covering live albums or compilation albums that were used as soundtracks for films. And for those of you disappointed about that, well, fuck you, this is my video. It's time to take a journey down the highway to hell with the band that paved it. This is AC/DC. AC/DC was formed in the early 1970s by Angus and Malcolm Young, two Scottish immigrants whose father moved them to Australia in the mid-1960s. They quickly discovered and fell in love with rock and roll when their older brother George formed a band and became a huge celebrity with his band, the Easy Beats, who were a band who had multiple top 5 singles in Australia in the 1960s, and even scored a top 20 hit in the US with the song Friday on My Mind in the mid to late 1960s. This brother, George Young, eventually went on with his bandmate from the Easy Beats, Harry Vanda, and became a longtime producer for AC/DC. Inspired by their older brother, Angus and Malcolm quickly left school and joined separate bands. But after those ventures didn't pan out, they decided to form their own band. And with this new band, they needed a name, and family once again helped them strike inspiration. Their sister's sewing machine provided the name for the band. On the back of the sewing machine, it said alternating current, direct current, referring to the electricity of the machine. Instead of saying that, it was shortened to AC/DC. And the story goes that someone just brought it up when they were brainstorming band names, and Angus and Malcolm just fell in love with it. To them, it exemplified power, electricity, and energy, which is what they wanted their music to be. Malcolm Young tells a story of a time when he met a local cab driver who let him know that AC/DC was also a slang term used for bisexuals. And they briefly considered changing the name, but they went with the name, and the rest is history. Another iconic piece of AC/DC was also provided by that sewing machine. Angus Young's famous schoolboy outfit that he would continue to wear on stage even to this day. Now, before that, he had tried several different costumes, which included such things as a gorilla suit and a Superman costume with an A instead of an S, which he said stood for Super Ang. Regardless, once the schoolboy uniform was put on, he never went back, and it's been a mainstay of their live shows ever since. AC/DC went into the studio with the Young brothers, a couple of useless cunts on guitar and bass that no one's ever heard of, and their original vocalist, Dave Evans, to record their debut single, Can I Sit Next to You, Girl? And oh my god, this song is fucking torture. Dave Evans just does not fit this band. It sounds so terrible. It's like the guy who replaced Vince Neil in Motley Crue. It's just unbearable to listen to. There is a B-side to this record with a song called Rockin' in the Parlor, but it's just not that memorable. And while it is better than the A-side to that record, it's just bogged down by Dave Evans. I can't. God, this song is terrible! And the Young brothers quickly realized that his vocals made them wish there was a late-term abortion rule. They then fired Evans and decided to audition new singers, and luckily, they found the perfect fit for AC/DC. The man who paved a high-voltage highway to hell, Bon motherfucking Scott. It's difficult to say just how big an impact Bon Scott had on the band with his bluesy, high shrill vocals and his incredible stage presence, but it was on full display on their first international release, High Voltage. Now, High Voltage is actually their first international release, but there were two releases before this. T.N.T. and High Voltage, which were only released in Australia. Now, I'm not going to cover these either because High Voltage is really just a compilation of all the best tracks off of these two albums. And, yeah, it's a pretty big step up. Most of these great songs came off T.N.T. rather than High Voltage. But these two albums put together, with all their best tracks, created probably the most memorable debut of a rock band ever. While the American release of High Voltage had a memorable cover of just Angus Young jutting out and saying, "Fuck yeah, I'm playing guitar, you better fucking listen," the European cover was not so great. It looks like a shit Elton John took while high on Quaalude. My personal favorite off this album, It's a Long Way to the Top. A memorable riff, and a really seemingly out of place but really rockin' bagpipe solo by Bon Scott, who was also a Scottish immigrant in Australia. Oh yeah, Bon Scott. Oh, I wonder where he's from. It's one of those songs that you've just heard all over the place and will probably hear a million more times. Same thing goes for another #1 single off this album, T.N.T. Now, if you're familiar with rock and roll music in any capacity, you've heard T.N.T. somewhere. On the radio, in TV, video games, movies, you've heard it somewhere, let's be honest. T.N.T. is just one of those songs that people always play, and for good fucking reason. It kicks ass.
'Cause I'm T.N.T. I'm dynamite. T.N.T. And I'll win that fight. T.N.T. I'm a power load. T.N.T. Watch me explode.
There is another song on this album that's noteworthy, not exactly for the music, but for something that it caused. There was a song off of T.N.T. called Baby Please Don't Go. And this is noteworthy because they played this on an Australian countdown show, and Bon Scott decided to dress in drag, which at the time freaked a lot of people out. But today you say, "Oh, that's so special, he's expressing himself, he identifies as a woman." Yeah, it's that kind of outlandishness that made Bon Scott the fucking awesome frontman he was. He was willing to do whatever to make a show memorable. With another release coming later in 1976, AC/DC set a great standard for releasing fantastic albums at a pretty consistent rate throughout the 1970s. And their next release was a fitting follow-up to the massive debut of High Voltage.
Dirty deeds, got my cheek. Dirty deeds, got my cheek. Dirty deeds, got my cheek. Dirty deeds and the thunder cheek. Dirty deeds and the thunder cheek.
Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap was an amazing follow-up to High Voltage, and it did just as good in sales, selling 6 million records in the US. Dirty Deeds was the first album that featured bassist Cliff Williams and drummer Phil Rudd, replacing a bunch of rotating useless cunts no one remembers. The title track off this album is yet another iconic bit of rock and roll that you've definitely heard somewhere. Whether it be TV, movies, whatever. AC/DC is just one of those bands whose music is so fucking fantastic that everybody uses it in everything, and you never get sick of it. Hey, you don't even need to watch this video. You don't need to binge their discography like I did. You've heard all their shit. Even if you don't know who AC/DC is, you know their discography. It's one of those bands that's such an earworm, it digs in your brain, and you can never forget it. Again, unless you're Malcolm Young, but we'll get there. Big Balls is just one of those songs you put on and it instantly makes you smile. The whole thing is just one big fucking sex joke, and it's just one of those tracks where you're laughing or smiling the whole time. And Bon Scott absolutely sells it in such a hilarious way. I can't help but laugh every time I hear it.
I've got big balls. I've got big balls. They're such big balls, and they're dainty big balls. And he's got big balls, and she's got big balls. But we've got the biggest balls of them all.
I should also briefly mention that the Australian version of Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap is often the preferred one because it features the song Jailbreak, which, yeah, I have to say, this track kind of makes the Australian version worth the money over the international release.
Let me out of here. Jailbreak. 16 years.
There is one more track on Dirty Deeds I want to discuss, and it's one I feel doesn't get enough love. It's got a great riff, great vocals, and it's just an amazing song, Problem Child. This song for me was one of the first Bon Scott tracks I ever heard, and it absolutely sold me on AC/DC's early stuff. Before then, I was a diehard Brian Johnson guy, but once I heard Bon on this song, I'm like, you know what, this guy kicks ass.
I'm a problem child. I'm a problem child. Yes, I am. I'm a problem child. And I'm wild.
After the monster success of Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, they released what I believe to be their overall most underrated album ever of any era, Let There Be Rock. I absolutely fucking love this album. I've owned 3 copies of this album. I've wore out every single one except the one I currently have. This is probably my second favorite Bon Scott album, but we'll get to my favorites soon. It's also interesting to note that Dave Mustaine said that if it wasn't for Let There Be Rock, he wouldn't have gotten where he is today in the world of heavy metal. Thank that whore who gave you pot, Dave. Keep making love to that gorilla, because it ain't done. Speaking of which, the track Overdose. This isn't my absolute favorite track on this album, but it's still in my top 5 off this one. It's just so good. AC/DC are known for their hard-hitting bluesy riffs, and it's on full display in this track.
Ain't nothing I can do. I overdose on you.
My favorite track on this album, however, is actually the final one, Whole Lotta Rosie. This is just a fast-paced, hard, in-your-face track that is just a great, energetic way to close out the album. Now, the story behind it is just as entertaining as listening to it. Whole Lotta Rosie is based on an experience that Bon Scott had, for lack of a better term, shacking up with an obese woman. Rock and roll, man. This album doesn't have as many #1 or top 10 singles on it, and that's why people don't remember it, but I fucking love it. It's an amazing album. It's underrated as shit. Why the fuck are you listening to me? Go listen to it now. I'll wait. What, you're still fucking here? Alright, I'll go on.
When did you get time to actually make the records and write the music?
Hotel rooms, wherever.
Just after our stuff, you know?
After hours.
Yeah. You sort of got to make the time, you know? Things fall into place by themselves. Yeah, sometimes.
But what about the original ideas, though?
You got to keep your eyes and ears open for lines and words and all, you know, and ideas and just pictures, you know? And so.
And kangaroos.
Kangaroos, yeah, and you're right around it, you know?
While I personally argue that Let There Be Rock is the most underrated, a lot of people argue that the next one, released in 1978, is actually their most underrated record, that being Powerage. I argue that it's not because it actually had a song that AC/DC fans continue to remember, Rock and Roll Damnation. And it's really the only song off Powerage that I actually remember. Sorry to say that, Powerage fans. It's a good album, but other than the opening track, it's a pretty forgettable piece. Riff Raff's good, though. While I may feel that Powerage is not their most underrated album, I will wholeheartedly agree that the next album, released on July 27th, 1979, is actually the best album of the Bon Scott era. You've definitely heard Highway to Hell, you've heard Touch Too Much, you've heard If You Want Blood, you've heard all of these tracks. They even named their first live album If You Want Blood, but you're not getting it.
If you want blood, you got it. Blood on the streets, blood on the rocks, blood in the gutter, every last drop you want blood.
Again, the opening track to Highway to Hell, the title track, is a song you've heard somewhere. Even if you're not a rock and roll fan, you've heard this song and you know every word. This album is not just a one-trick pony. Girls Got Rhythm, in my opinion, is the most underrated track on this album. It's fast-paced, fun, and just a great, great track.
The girls got a rhythm, girls got a rhythm, the girls got a rhythm, girls got a rhythm. She got the backseat rhythm, backseat rhythm, the girls got a rhythm.
There is one more song that's noteworthy on this album, and that's Night Prowler. But that's a story that we'll have to get into in the late 80s. After releasing Highway to Hell, which is the best-selling album of the Bon Scott era, going platinum 22 times in the US, which is double diamond, sadly the Bon Scott era was about to come to a tragic end. One night in the UK, Bon Scott died from alcohol poisoning after he fell asleep in a car and choked on his own vomit. Now, me personally, I think rock stars should know how to throw up so they don't fucking die. I mean, look at Zakk Wylde. That dude drank like a fish for 30 years. He got kicked out of Ozzy's band for being too drunk. That's like getting kicked out of Hitler's house for telling too many Jew jokes. Regardless, as AC/DC does, they soldiered on. They hired replacement singer Brian Johnson. It should be noted that while he's not credited on this next album, apparently Bon's sister did say that he wrote a majority of the stuff on this album. Regardless of whether he's credited or not, this album is one of the greatest ever recorded in music history.
I walked on and I just saw all these banners, rest in peace, on, you know, and I went, oh boy, what have I let myself in for? Oh my God, it's it's impossible. I just, you know, how am I ever gonna do this, you know? And everywhere, but right in the middle of it, there was one banner, a big one, and it just said, "Good luck, Brian." That's all I needed. Yeah. I just went, phew, and that's what I wanted. I just went, oh.
Yeah, but I think you were very quick adopted by everybody around the world.
Yeah. And it was wonderful. And the first thing I did, we did 2 songs. Oh, gosh, darn it, what were the first 2 songs was, it was Bad Boy Boogie, and the other one, anyway, I sang the same lyrics to both songs. I was so nervous, I sang the first song, and then I sang the second one with the same words, because I couldn't hear anything with the noise. And I could see the audience going,
they don't sing the same as me.
and he's going, well, he must be avant-garde rock and roll. He's singing anything he wants. And I finished it, and I was going, oh, God, what have I done? And Malcolm looked at us, and he went, the fuck was that?
Released in July of 1980 on Atlantic Records, Back in Black, the first of the Brian Johnson era, shot to the top of the US charts, and is currently number 2 on the best-selling albums of all time, sitting just behind Michael Jackson's Thriller at over 40 million copies sold to date. This, in my opinion, is the best AC/DC album of all time. And I don't think I'll get much dispute from people. This album has probably the best lineup of any AC/DC album because there's not one bad song. The opening song, Hell's Bells, with its intro and its heavy fucking riff, was seen as the eulogy song for Bon Scott, and I see it as a fitting send-off to a rock and roll god. He rode the highway to hell, and now he's playing Ding Dong Ditch with Satan. The next big one, Shoot to Thrill. This song is just a high-octane rock and roll anthem. Dominating riff, the screaming vocals of Brian Johnson on full display. Some people would argue that this riff even sounds a bit metalish. Like, there's some people who try to categorize AC/DC as metal or rock, but you can't. AC/DC are just fucking AC/DC. While I'm only talking about the major big hits on this album, I think that, well, let's just say my boss wouldn't be happy if I didn't mention his favorite track, Have a Drink on Me.
Don't make me lynch you, goddammit!
Okay, I'll talk about it, Jesus. Have a Drink on Me is just another great track because, as I said, there's not a bad song on this album. This is just a slow, fun, bluesy song that just displays Brian Johnson's vocals at their best. Coming up next is the title track, Back in Black. Yet another track you've definitely heard somewhere. It's just one of those songs that's always present in media of any kind. It's like walking or breathing. You're born to know fucking Back in Black. The track after Back in Black, however, was actually their biggest charting single in the US to date, You Shook Me All Night Long. Yet another song you just hear a shitload of and never get tired of it. You know the riff, you know this chorus, you've tried to sing it and you fucking failed, you goddamn failure.
You shook me all night long. Yeah, you shook me all night long.
Sadly though, Back in Black would be their biggest success in the 1980s, as it would kind of go downhill a little bit, but not much. Their next album also charted very well. For Those About to Rock, We Salute You. It was really kind of a one-song album to me. I'm sorry, I know people like songs like Evil Walks, Breaking the Rules, Inject the Venom, and Let's Get It Up. But for me, the title track is what makes it. For Those About to Rock, We Salute You is a great, great track that is often used as their live show closer, using actual cannon fire and people chanting along with the song. And also, in recent years, it's been adopted as the goal song for the Columbus Blue Jackets of the NHL, where they fire a motherfucking cannon after they score a goal. I like hockey, don't be such a hoser, I'm sorry, but it's just good stuff, eh?
Do you think that AC/DC music in any way could be considered a bad influence on grown teens?
No, because music's just listened to, you know. It's like a painting, you know. If somebody sees a painting, I mean, they see it. Unless they're an artist, they may get influenced by it. But as far as influencing somebody to copy that, or that, no, I think not. I think that takes it a bit far, you know. Mm-hmm. I think everyone's responsible, you know, like each individual's responsible for what he does, you know. If I go out and go and hit him, he's going to hit me back, I suppose. Oh, mate.
Again, I kind of am just glossing over these mid-80s albums because, to be honest, they're not very memorable. Like, Flick of the Switch is another album that's kind of a couple songs that are really good. Like, Guns for Hire is a great song.
Boy, you better talk about that landslide. I'll beat the fuck out of you.
Ow! Stop! Okay, I'll talk about Landslide. Jesus. Ow! Okay. Landslide. No one remembers this fucking song. Next!
That is one big pile of shit.
I'm sorry, there's some of you who might like this out there, and to that I say, what are you, fucking high? It's just so fucking forgettable. Especially for a fan of AC/DC like me, it's just a piece of shit. It's not even like a fly in the wall, it's like somebody just took a massive shit and then fastballed it onto the wall. And these were also kind of trying times for the band, as in the mid-80s. Now, around this time, Phil Rudd had to leave the band due to issues with drugs, but they got this guy, Simon Wright, who had played on the Dio album, Lock Up the Wolves. Well, it doesn't really matter because every AC/DC drummer kind of sounds the fucking same. In the mid-80s, the band found themselves in the midst of a very serious investigation involving a serial killer. That serial killer, known as the Night Stalker, was responsible for the deaths of over 11 people, and when the cops found this out, they looked to the song Night Prowler, which was actually, according to the band, written about being a bad teenager, you know, sneaking out of the house and prowling on your girlfriend. Thanks, Malcolm Young. You bet you were glad to forget that. Thanks to this, AC/DC found themselves at the top of the list of bands that politicians, specifically Tipper Gore, wife of Man Bear Pig himself, Al Gore. And this list was bands that they deemed obscene and children should never listen to. And it's sad to see other bands like Metallica and the rest of the Big Four on that list as well. It's just another case of people finding a scapegoat for something that they have no explanation for. Also, another tragic thing at this time, Malcolm Young seemed to be following in the footsteps of Bon Scott as he was drinking heavily, and he was on the brink of death. But near the end of a tour, he had his nephew fill in on guitar while he slipped into Alcoholics Anonymous, and thankfully, he was able to put down the bottle. Thankfully, he was able to come back into the studio for their next album, Blow Up Your Video. This is another album that's not very memorable and only has a couple of good songs on it. Heat Seeker, Mean Streak, and This Means War are just a couple of songs that save this album from being a complete failure, in my opinion. They had another lineup change with Chris Slade taking over drumming duties. Some would argue that Phil Rudd is the best AC/DC drummer ever, but there's a lot of legitimate arguments for Chris Slade, and for good reason. The dude is a fucking awesome drummer. Regardless, their next album is considered one of the best comebacks of any rock band ever.
You've been thunderstruck. Thunderstruck. Yeah, thunderstruck.
Released in September of 1990, Razor's Edge was AC/DC's comeback to mainstream rock. Another song you know without even liking this fucking band, Thunderstruck. Don't lie, if you own a guitar, you've tried to play this riff. And failed, you fucking loser. This album is far from a one-trick pony. It also had a high-charting single with Money Talks. They never play it live, which pisses me off because this track is fucking awesome. It's thanks to this track that my copy of Razor's Edge doesn't work anymore. The title track to this album also is a great, great track. It's slow, bluesy, and Brian Johnson's vocals are on full display. Riding high off the success of Razor's Edge, they went back into the studio with everybody's favorite Metallica producer, Rick Rubin. Boo! Yeah, he's better than Bob Rock, assholes. That's right, I fucking said it. Come at me, bro. For this era, Phil Rudd finally sobered up and they were able to bring him back. Regardless of the Rick Rubin production, Ballbreaker is a fantastic, fantastic album cover. I know it doesn't make any sense, but that's really all this album is, a fucking cover. It's not much else. It's not a very memorable album, but the only reason people remember it is because Rick Rubin produced it. There's not one single memorable track off this album. After the release of Ballbreaker, they went on a lengthy tour, which sadly led to one more tragedy that the band had to face. Just before a concert, there was a rush to the front of the stage where 6 people were trampled to death and 11 more injured. AC/DC didn't know what happened, and to this day, Malcolm Young refuses to talk about it, mostly because he doesn't remember it happened. Again, we'll get there. Regardless, they went back into the studio with George Young and Harry Vanda to record their debut in the new millennium, Stiff Upper Lip. This isn't a bad album, but I hesitate to call it good. A few tracks that are good and a few that are kind of hit and miss with me. The title track, Stiff Upper Lip, is a fun song. It's bluesy. It's just full-on AC/DC in all its glory. It's a very early 2000s track, but it's still just full-blown, in-your-face AC/DC. Other than that, there's not really that many songs off this album worth noting, so sadly in the new millennium, AC/DC kind of got lackadaisical with their album releases. I think that's partially to do with their age and them getting kind of tired, but you know AC/DC was known for their consistent album releases, and it took them 7 years to release another album. That album was Black Ice. I'm glad to say I was pleasantly surprised by this album. Is it good? No, but is it bad? Hell no. Rock and Roll Train, Big Jack, and War Machine. All fantastic songs that were even utilized in the film Iron Man 2. It's fitting that they used a lot of these songs for Iron Man 2 because, like this album, that film was also mediocre and underperformed. To me, as far as AC/DC albums go, Black Ice is like that trust fund kid who's still mooching off his parents in his late 20s. He's just there. As joked about several times in this review, Malcolm Young was soon about to check out. Sadly, Malcolm Young was diagnosed with dementia, and sadly had to leave the band, as he pretty much forgot how to play guitar altogether and can't remember any AC/DC songs. Luckily though, they found a replacement in Malcolm and Angus's 40-year-old nephew, Stephen Young, keeping it in the family like they were from Mississippi. Released in 2014, Rock or Bust was seen as kind of a disappointment to some AC/DC fans, myself included, but hey, it was a new AC/DC album, and we went out and bought it. It's not to say it's a wholly bad album. There is one good song on it, and that is Play Ball. This is one of the few tracks off the album that actually got a music video. For how old these guys are, they still look like they're having a good time. They went on tour to promote this album, but about a third of the way through, Brian Johnson sadly bowed out of the band, citing problems with his hearing, and if he continued to tour, he would probably go completely deaf. This started kind of a nervous shakedown with the band, as they needed to replace their longtime singer. And at the same time, as Phil Rudd had come back from the band, he was facing charges of both murder and drug possession, of which both he was exonerated from, and he tried to have a dirty deed done dirt cheap.
Back home, Rudd launched his own album. It was his first attempt at going it alone. He has even plastered the windows of his palatial home with the album cover. It was indeed a dirty deed, but not dirt cheap. When Rudd's new solo album flopped, he flipped, ringing a friend and asking him to take out a former personal assistant who worked on the album. Rudd even rang the victim direct and threatened to kill him. The friend says Rudd offered him $200,000 plus one of his cars and a motorbike or a house, which he believed was payment for the deed.
And then at Rock or Bust, with the criminal charges, Chris Slade had been brought back in. So who did they get to replace a rock and roll god in Brian Johnson? Udo Dirkschneider from Accept, who sounds like Bon and Brian together? No. Comedian Jim Brewer, who does an amazing Brian Johnson impression? Fuck no. They went with a guy who's 40 years past his prime and looks like a fat pirate taking a mean dump. Axl fucking Rose. Ugh! Regardless, though, AC/DC continue to be one of the most iconic and enduring rock bands in music history, and I don't want them to go anytime soon. And again, unless you're Malcolm Young, you will never forget AC/DC.
Subscribe to the Downfall Network.